You know, I think if you look at the teaching of Jesus, you can see that one of the best methods of teaching is to use an illustration or a comparison. In the New Testament, they are referred to as parables, where Jesus will give some type of an illustration from the physical world to illustrate certain points in the spiritual realm. Well, we're going to try to do that this evening about something that we've done before. It won't be a first. Many other people have done as well. But hopefully we'll be able to give ourselves kind of a pep talk, kind of a boost to encourage us a bit in our efforts to serve God. We have the Olympic Games, I believe, every 4 years. I believe that is correct. And we have the Winter Olympics. And both of them use the gold medal as being the highest recognition of achievement. Of course, in the Olympics, there would be 3 medals, the gold, the silver, and the bronze. But the gold medal is the highest level of achievement. And most athletes in the realm of the Olympics, that really is their goal, to win a gold medal. And quite often you'll see expressions that will say going for the gold. And what they're talking about is here's a person who set out with the hope of accomplishing the goal of having a gold medal. Well, in the New Testament, there are really several passages that sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly relate that hope for achievement with the Christian. So that in effect, Christians are, in a sense, going for the goal. In Revelation chapter 21, in talking about heaven, in talking about the city that hath no need of the sun, neither the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it. In talking about that city, in verse 21, he said, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls, every several gate of 1 pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. Now, we've discussed that before. Obviously, that is a figure of speech. I'm not an expert in that area. I think Ray's kind of an expert in that area, and he realizes that gold, when it's as pure as it can be, is not transparent like glass. But the whole idea is to suggest that all impurities are removed from it. And so he's talking about something that everyone relates to. You know, every generation relates to the idea of gold. It doesn't matter how far you go back in the history of man. Anytime there's been a monetary system, gold has always been an important part of that, always. It is the metal. Now, sometimes it's not the most, as far as I understand, it may not be the most expensive metal, but it is the metal that everybody identifies with as being that which would represent the highest value. And so that's why I would suppose that those gold medals have begun to be given out at the Olympics. Now, I heard a discussion of this the other day. They used to be just solid, pure gold, and they were very expensive. And the people who won them had something that was really worth a great deal of money. Now, I don't think that's true. I think they're now gold-plated, so they don't have the value, the intrinsic value that they once did. Now, the value is simply in the fact that the person possesses it can say that I was the best in the world at that particular time. But we want to examine this, and we want to think a little about it. What is it that makes an Olympic athlete a gold medalist? Meaning that it makes him achieve the highest level of achievement that he or she can possibly achieve. Well, we're going to look at some characteristics, and it's interesting to see that in the New Testament we see the same characteristics are related, and sometimes there are actually direct references to athletic contests. And we are actually relating the life of the Christian to those athletes, and sometimes not. But the idea is much the same. If a person wants to be a gold medalist, there is one thing that is absolutely essential. And if he doesn't or she doesn't have that one thing, then everything else will not fall into place. There has to be a desire for that. There has to be a desire, because there are just too many too much cost involved. You know, if you have a great desire for something, then that's something that you're willing to invest whatever's necessary to achieve. And if you don't have a great desire for it, then you don't. Sometimes if you listen to sports commentators about any type of athletics, whether it's the Olympics or NFL or NBA or whatever, you'll hear a commentator say that, well, you know what, they just wanted it worse. Meaning that the person who desired it the most worked the hardest, and therefore they achieved the goal that they were hoping to achieve. Well, in that sense, we can liken that to you and I as a Christian. When we look back to the book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul in the first chapter and verse 23 tells us in this particular instance, he said, talking about, you know, he's on the verge. He thinks of death sometimes because of his work. And he said, I'm in a strait betwixt the two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. Now, that is a very strange statement. Paul said, now, you know, my desire is that I could leave this world. Why? I mean, what is it that we hope to achieve in being a Christian in the first place? It's being with God in eternity. Many times people here in their prayers will say that we desire nothing more than a home with you in heaven. We're not trying to gain any material advantage from that. What we're trying to gain from our service to God is to be saved eternally, to be able to be with Him eternally. And the Apostle Paul simply says that. and desire dictates to a great extent what we do with our life. I've looked many times at athletes because I've been around so much of them because of coaching myself and children coaching and playing, and I've observed a lot of them. And one thing I've observed is that I've seen athletes who had great abilities but did not reach the capabilities that they had because they didn't care. They were not interested in working. They didn't have the desire that just pushed them to that end. On the other hand, I've seen athletes who really didn't have a high level of skill who were very successful because they were very much desiring to achieve that goal. And that's what the Apostle Paul is suggesting to you. He's saying we have to have a burning and consuming desire if we hope to go to heaven, to achieve that goal, those golden streaks, just like those who want to achieve a gold medal must have a burning desire to achieve that. One of the things that's illustrated in Hebrews 11 and 16 that's to me very interesting. In Hebrews 11 and 16, he's talking about Abraham, and specifically, he's talking about Abraham being a person who has left his father's country. Now, he's gone to what is said to be a better country. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. But here's the reason he did so. But now they desire a better country. Now, when you think about that, you realize the point he's making. Why do you think Abraham was willing to go through all that he went through to achieve the promise that God had given him? Because he had a desire to achieve it. And had it not been for that desire, then what do you think Abraham would have done? If he didn't desire what God was offering, and he was content to just live in the Ur of the Chaldees, he would just stay there. And he would have made no effort. The same thing is true of Christians today. If they don't have a desire to go to heaven when they die, they don't make any preparation for it. They have no desire. Their desire is tied to the things of this world. And consequently, they, unlike Abraham, they don't put forth whatever effort is necessary because they simply don't have the desire. We need to understand it. And you know, when you look over to 1 Timothy 2, there's another time that the word desire is used. In this particular case, he is talking about desiring the sincere milk of the Word. It's kind of interesting. Verse 1 says, wherefore laying aside all malice and all guile and hypocrisies and envyings and all evil speakings, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the Word, that you may grow thereby. One of the things you see with athletes is that they will strive to gain all the information possible to be able to enable them to succeed. You know what a lot of people don't realize? One of the greatest illustrations that you have of what we're talking about here probably comes from the state of Tennessee. There's always this discussion about who the greatest quarterback in the NFL was. Well, most people relate it to their generation. And so most people in this generation are really talking about either Tom Brady or they're talking about Peyton Manning. Well, if you were to ask me which of those two is the most talented, I don't think I have any problem answering that question. I think Tom Brady is a more talented quarterback than Peyton Manning. But if you ask me which of them works the hardest, which of them desires it the most, and therefore has been very successful, I would have to say that Peyton Manning would be. If you ever have read anything about him, you're talking about a man that when he was playing football, I mean, he basically desired to win so badly that everything he did, he would sit and watch film and film and film. Can you imagine how boring that is? But why do you think that when he got on the field that every time he would be able to avoid defensive linemen because he knew exactly what they were going to do? Why do you think that he would be able to run routes that would evade defenders? Because he knew exactly what they were going to do. How do you think that happened? Because desire drove him to that end. I mean, you look at him, he's not the fastest, doesn't have the strongest arm. But I tell you what he does, he wins. And why? Because he desires it. And that's kind of what it's saying here of the Christian. The Christian has to understand that if we want to achieve that goal, that is, those golden streets of heaven, then we have to understand that the sincere milk of the Word that God has given it, that's the key. So we have to devote ourselves to having an understanding of it and spend some time with it. And it may be that it's something that maybe we're not the greatest Bible scholar, but we can gather from that the things that are needed in order to serve God acceptably. And that's a problem a lot of people have. A lot of people just really don't want to spend the time with God's Word, and consequently, they don't know what God expects of them. And I think that's something that's extremely important. You have to also realize that desire that you have is sometimes referred to as hope. And that's what hope is anyway. Hope is a desire to achieve something. That's what hope is really defined as. If you go over to the 6th chapter of the book of Hebrews, beginning in verse 17, he says, wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of the promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we may have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope which is set before us. Which hope we have, the desire to be with God, as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters from that within the veil, whether the forerunner for us is entered, even Jesus, made an high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the whole point of that is to say that the desire that we have is the hope that secures us, that we hope to be with God in eternity. The second problem, the thing that we have to have is commitment. If you don't have commitment to something, you're not going to succeed. That is a long and short of it. You have to be committed to it. You know, in today's world, sometimes you hear people say that an athlete has bought in to what the coach has to say. And he has to. He has to be committed to that. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to approach football, for example, or basketball or baseball. And you have to be committed to what you're doing. You have to be committed. And when you look to the New Testament, that commitment has to be real. It can't be pretended. It can't be something that we talk about and something that we try to impress other people with the idea that it's there. It has to be a real commitment. It has to be something that is really burning in our heart. And if it's not, then we're not going to succeed. In Luke 10 and 25, there was a certain lawyer came to Jesus. And he said, Master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He said, what's written in the law, how readest thou? And this man answered and said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, with all thy mind, thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right, this do, and thou shalt live. If you've ever watched the movie Rudy, you really understand what he's saying there. You're talking about a person who's so committed to something that even though it seemed that it was impossible to be accomplished, it was accomplished. He was able to play on that varsity football team at Notre Dame. Commitment is extremely important, and it can't be pretended. And if you know what's interesting to me, you may have seen the movie Rudy. What you may not know is that the real person, not the person who played it in the movie, but the real person is now a much in demand motivational speaker throughout the United States. And you see him pretty often on various talk shows on television and hear him on the radio. Why? Because he was committed. He was committed and he was able to achieve that which he desired. In order for a servant of Christ to be able to achieve the goal, that is to be saved eternally, there has to be a pledge of obedience, and it can't be a conditional pledge. It has to be an unconditional. He has to be committed to that which he is committing himself to. When you look at Romans 6, that's exactly what he means in verse 16 when he said, "Know you not to whom you owe yourselves servants to obey, your servants ye are to whom you obey. Whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you, then made free from sin and become the servants of righteousness." Now, when you think of this as a commitment to something, the only first-hand experience that I've ever had with a professional athlete would be one summer when I worked on my uncle's farm, and his son was a professional football player in Canada. And I think still that commitment that he had to become a professional athlete, because he really wasn't the most talented. He didn't succeed in the United States. He went to Canada to achieve it. But even there, in order to stay at that level for the 13 years that he played there, he worked all the time at it. So, I would get up and go to the breakfast table, and when I got to the breakfast table at about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, he'd already been out and run 5 miles. You have to be committed to something. If you're not committed to it, you're not going to achieve it. And that's something we learn from athletes. Look into the New Testament and think about the New Testament Christians and the commitment that they had. I don't think we really appreciate it much when we read the words in Acts 2 and 42. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, and the breaking of bread and prayers. And down in verse 46, and they continued daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking of bread from house to house did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. Do you understand the opposition they were facing when they were doing that? That they were a part of the Jewish nation and everyone looked at them as oddballs and weird, and there was every kind of opposition, including physical opposition. And so much so that eventually, in chapter 8 of this passage, they weren't able to meet in the temple. They weren't able to just openly meet in the city. Finally, they had to flee. And in verse 4 of Acts chapter 8, therefore, they that were scattered abroad whenever we're preaching the word. So their commitment didn't stop at the city limits. They were committed to pleasing God and achieving that goal of eternal life, and there was nothing going to stand in their way, even being driven from their homeland by persecution. The other thing that's important is there has to be some involvement. We need to realize that unless we're involved in something, we're not going to achieve it. I don't care how much you desire to be an Olympic athlete, unless you get involved in the process and put forth whatever efforts necessary, it's never going to happen, no matter what your talent level is. Acts 2 and 40, I think, illustrates that point when Peter said, "Save yourselves from this untoward generation." In Philippians 2, the Apostle Paul made a similar statement to the people at Philippi when he told them there, as dearly beloved, as you've always obeyed as in my presence, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God which worketh in you to both the will and to do his good pleasure. Everyone understands if there's a goal you want to achieve, there has to be some involvement in achieving it. It's a working process. A person doesn't just happen to be a great athlete. I think in days gone by, sometimes people could fake it. And if you've ever seen the story of Babe Ruth, you kind of see an athlete who probably, who knows what potential he would have had. But if you've ever read anything about him or seen anything about him, he really wasn't involved in that process much. He had a lot of natural ability. But you also see how his wife ended up, and that kind of tells you that how things could have been had he chosen to do differently. He just didn't work at it. And he was never what he could have been. People may say, oh, what a great player he was. But the things that he was involved in were not helping him. They were hindering him. And we need to understand that. Just understand how far he could have gone. Well, you say, well, look, he did this and that and the other. So what? But just look at his life, see how it ended. And see how his career ended. And you might understand a little bit better of why involvement might have really helped him a great deal of actually putting some effort into it rather than just letting everything fall into place. We can't do that as Christians. We can't just let everything happen. We have to deliberately serve God. And we have to be involved. And if we're not, then we will not be able to achieve that goal that just like an Olympic athlete who doesn't put forth the effort, no matter how talented, is not going to be able to achieve that goal. In the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 3, the Apostle Paul said this, remembering without ceasing your work of faith and labor of love and patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the sight of God our Father. Knowing, brethren, beloved, your election of God, for our gospel came not unto you in word only, but also in power and in the Holy Ghost with much assurance, as ye know what manner of men we were among you for your sake. And you became followers of us in the Lord, having received the word in much affliction with joy of the Holy Ghost. Now you stop and think for a moment, and you kind of put together some two and twos here, I guess we might say. When you think of the city of Thessalonica, you need to remember the connection with the city of Berea. They were very close to each other. And you remember that those in Berea were more noble than those where? In Thessalonica. You don't sometimes realize how much effort was required on these people's part to remain faithful to God. There has to be a great deal of involvement, or else we will simply not succeed. And there has to be a lot of sacrifice. I sometimes think, I was listening the other day to a radio program, a sports program, and they were talking about James Harrison, who plays football for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He retired. I think he's 42 or 43 years old. That's old in football, really old, especially for a defensive lineman. He retired. The team wasn't very good without him. And one of the coaches called him and said, hey, would you like to come back? And he was able to do that. Do you know why? Because you know what he'd been doing while he was at home for the year that he set out? Worked every day. Got up every day, lifted weights, ran. And he said on that radio program that he spent about $300,000 a year on his health care. He said he thought it was a good investment because of the millions of dollars they were paying him. He didn't think it was anything that he shouldn't have done. On chiropractors, acupuncture, because he's an old man. It's hard to keep doing what he's doing. Now, I got a feeling all that's not too pleasant. I don't think that would be a pleasant experience, but it ended up with him being able to do what he hoped to do. The Apostle Paul, and one of the classic passages is 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He actually referred to what we're talking about here with James Harrison, and he's talking about athletes. And probably, since he lived in close proximity, and the book of Corinthians was written to the church at Corinth, which was very close to Athens, which was where the original Olympics were, and were even in existence at that time, in one form. Not exactly as today, obviously, but in another form. And you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9 there in verse 24, and here's what he said. Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize. So run that you may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now that word temperate means there's a lot of sacrifices that he makes in order to accomplish the purpose he desires. Now they did do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. Those Olympic athletes want that gold medal. What you want is that gold city. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly. So fight I, not as one that beateth the air. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection. Now you think of the word sacrifice. lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. There are things that I sometimes observe, and I wonder how people accomplish it. Have you ever watched a television show about Navy SEAL training? Do you believe you could do that? Have you ever watched a television show about the Ranger training in the mountains of North Georgia? You think you could accomplish that? You know, when you start looking at those things, you realize that those people have to have an attitude of sacrifice that's tremendous to be able to achieve what they achieve. And that is true of any athlete. I mean, I don't know that there's anybody that just naturally gets up in the morning and wants to suffer physically all day long. But that's what's necessary in order to achieve the goal that they want to achieve. And Paul likens that to the Christian, saying that we too must make sacrifices to achieve. There's another directly related passage to athletics, and it's in the 12th chapter of the book of Hebrews in verse 1. And again, he's talking about something that would be very similar to the Olympics of the modern day. Wherefore, seeing we also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Now you think about what he said. Set aside every sin and let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us. I think people need to realize that sacrifice is a great part of anything that's worthwhile. Whether you're talking about athletics, trying to achieve some type of a championship situation, or whether you're talking about in a job to achieve the highest level, or you're talking about spiritually to go to heaven when you die. Sacrifice is just naturally a part of that, and we have to be careful that we are not going to allow something to interfere with that. When you go over to the book of Luke 18, and I chose Luke's account rather than Matthew's account of the rich young ruler because of the wording. Because the wording really says exactly what I want to say more clearly. There in verse 18, we find that there was a certain ruler came to Jesus, and he said, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said, "Why callest thou me good? None is good but God. Thou knowest the commandments." And he said, "All these have I kept from my youth up." Now when Jesus heard these things, he said unto them, and the reason I chose this particular passage that relates this story is because of this phrase. Yet lackest thou one thing. Sell all you have, and distribute to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. Come follow me. And when he heard this, he was very sorrowful, for he was very rich, and he didn't want to pay that one price. Lay aside every weight which does so easily beset us. And he says there is one thing, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice that one thing. And you and I as Christians need to learn from that there would be nothing that would keep us from being with God in eternity. The other thing to think about is endurance. You know, endurance, I think about a great deal. I have never run an actual marathon. Now, I have been forced to run the equivalent of marathons in the United States Army. And it's not an easy thing to do. Even when you're in very good shape, I'm not sure exactly at what point you begin to really have problems and your mind has to take control. Endurance is not something altogether bodily. Endurance, to a great extent, is a state of mind. An Olympic athlete has to be able to endure, has to make up their mind that they're going to go through whatever is necessary to be able to achieve the final result. The Christian who wants to go to heaven when they die has to decide that they're going to be willing to endure anything to accomplish that end. The inspired writer James, in James 5 and 11, is talking about Job and patience, but the word patience and endurance are very much the same, because you can see he actually uses the word endure here. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You have heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. I don't know, because I've not been involved in marathons, but I have a feeling that if a person just finally throws in the towel and quits, barring some major injury, they just quit because they just tired of doing it, not going to do it anymore. I have a feeling there's a big mental letdown there, that they have a terrible problem dealing with. And the Christian is somewhat like that as well. You know, when you look back and you think about Judas, who betrayed Jesus and who went out and killed himself, you can really see that what happened was he didn't endure. That's the problem. He didn't endure. Now, others of the apostles did endure. He did not. The pressures was brought upon him, and he simply turned away. He didn't endure. There were things he would have had to have endured. Look at the apostles. As far as I understand, every single one of the original apostles, with the exception of John, died an unnatural death, a violent death at the hands of the enemies of the cross. And even John, even though he did not die a violent death, died in exile because of his faith in Christ. That's what Judas had to look forward to. But Judas kind of thought, well, you know what, I'll just take the money and run. But it didn't work out that way, because when he began to look at what he had done, it overpowered him. You know, we need to understand endurance is kind of a mental thing. When you look at, you've heard of the patience of Job. Well, what was it? It was the ability to withstand every onslaught that Satan brought against him. And we need to understand that athletes are constantly, one of the things that's really a big issue with them is being able to have the physical stamina. But the greatest thing is to have the just mental toughness that nothing is going to deter you. And the Christian needs to learn that. And we need to learn to have that mental toughness if we expect that we're going to be saved eternally. We need to understand something. It's not people that begin a race who are winners, but it's those who finish that are rewarded. In 2 John 8, he said, John said to the person to whom he was writing, which is a little bit of a difficult thing to determine exactly who it was, but at any rate, he wrote and he said, look to yourselves, that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. And the idea he has is, you know, you may not endure, and you may give in. And if you do, then whatever you've done is going to be in vain. I believe that the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, as Jesus explains it in verse 20 and 22, there are two classes of people that really illustrate the point that we're making. He said, he that received the seed in the stony places, the same as he that heareth the word, and anon with joy receiveth it, yet hath he not rooted himself, but dureth for a while. But when tribulation or persecution ariseth, he doesn't endure, and he is offended. Verse 22 says, he also that receives seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful. He doesn't endure. He starts, but he doesn't endure. Have you ever thought about the number of people who start? Let me just remind you of something. Every level of competition in athletics, where is the greatest number of people involved? T-ball and baseball, probably, more than anywhere else. What happens every time you go to a different level? What happens every time? Fewer and fewer. I heard the other day the percentage of people who end up playing a professional sport that they've played all their lives, and it is minute. I mean, like 1 or 2% of all the people who play a particular sport end up achieving that. Is it because they don't have the talent? You know, I heard not too long ago of two people, one in soccer and one in baseball, were offered college scholarships and just said, I've done this so long, I'm tired of it, I'm not going to do it anymore, I'm through. Well, I mean, that's their choice. But I wonder how many people spiritually do the same thing. Who just say, I'm tired, I'm through, I'm not doing anymore, I'm not taking anymore, I don't really care. What happens? Endurance is extremely important. Now, let's think for a moment, and let's try to put all this together. You know, just like Olympic athletes who are going for the gold, we're here going for the gold of heaven, must have a number of things. You have to have a strong desire to succeed. If you don't have a strong desire to succeed, then you're going to have a difficult time. Because after all, when you start thinking about something that by definition is not an easy thing to do, then obviously desire becomes a big part of that. You have to have a commitment to the goal. You have to be committed to it. You can't have a half-hearted, a haphazard approach to being a Christian and think, hey, that's going to work, because it's not going to work. You have to become involved. You can't be a person that really doesn't put any effort into it, doesn't really care, doesn't really do anything, and expect that you're going to achieve that. You can't be a person that's not willing to sacrifice, that thinks that I'm going to have the best of both worlds. Sometimes we say that people try to straddle the fence. Sometimes we say that people want to be able to live with the devil and still be blessed with the Lord. Well, that's not going to happen. And you have to be willing to endure to the end. It's not something that you can just have a spurt of activity and then it's over. That's not the way it is. It's something that is a long-term effort, and that requires a great deal of endurance. You know, here's the thing that we need to realize. God did not say that being with Him in eternity was going to be an easy thing to achieve. If you can find that passage for me, then you show it to me, because I've never seen it. God said over and over and over again that if you want to be with me in eternity, this is going to be a difficult process. It's going to require a great deal out of you. Sometimes people will use this expression. They will say it doesn't take much of a man to be a Christian, but it takes all of him there is. He has to be all in. And if he's not, then he's not going to succeed. I've thought this morning in our class, we were talking about Gideon. And I'm not going to go back and read it, but you can probably remember the story of Gideon. Do you remember the first thing that God did to cut the number down? Do you remember the first step that was taken that would reduce the number of people going? He said, if you don't want to go, don't go. That was the first thing He said. So the first thing a Christian needs to realize, just like any athlete, first thing, if you're not committed to this, it's kind of like years ago I coached softball, and both times that I coached, I ended up picking up teams that had been horrible in the past and had coaches that didn't care. One of them had pizza parties instead of practice. And everybody got mad at me, and I said, look, yeah, we're here to have fun. We're here to have fun playing softball. If you want to do something else, go somewhere else. I mean, that's the way it is being a Christian. I mean, if you want to do something else, then you're just going to have to do something else. You know, if you look at Olympic athletes, if you ever get a chance to watch a documentary of an athlete who has won a gold medal, it's kind of interesting to watch it. And everything I'm telling you here that applies to you as a Christian, you can see in terms that are very easy to identify. So just stop and think about it. You want to be a Christian, you want to go to heaven when you die. You know, it is an achievable goal. A lot of people have this idea it's not an achievable goal. Well, it is. God makes it clear that it is achievable. But He also makes it clear that it's not easy. There's a difference between something not being achievable and not being easy. Yes, it can be done, but it requires a great deal out of you. And we need to stop and we need to think about that. You know, think about it as a Christian. If we want to become a Christian, I sometimes think about those people on the day of Pentecost. A lot of people don't stop to think about what happened there. They were in a culture that was completely foreign to everything that they were going to stand for in the future. And you think, well, that was horrible. But let me tell you something. Today, when a person is asked to be a Christian, we live in a culture, everything in our culture is completely diametrically opposed to you as a Christian. It's pretty much the same situation. And you know it's true in almost every generation. When you decide to become a Christian, there has to be a change that takes place. That's why it's described as repent ye therefore and be converted. And once you become a Christian, Jesus says, you teach them to observe all things whatsoever command you, lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. And there's an ongoing process. And it's not something that reaches a certain point and stops. It's not something that we just get up to a certain point and say, okay, everything's done. We've filled in all the blanks. As long as you're living, there are blanks to be filled in. And you need to understand that if we fall away from that, then we have to make a conscious effort to bring ourselves back to it so that we can be restored to that relationship we have with God. This song is a great song for what we're talking about. Give it some consideration as together we stand as we sing.